Here is a paraphrased version of your script, with the word order and sentence structure adjusted while preserving the original writing style and narrative flow. There exist records never intended for discovery. It wasn't a matter of them being lost. It wasn't that a courthouse fire consumed them, or that ink simply faded, or that the pages turned to dust with the passage of time. Though, in their own due course, all of those things did happen as well. These particular records endured for a different reason. The people who maintained them operated on the conviction that the past, if interred with sufficient depth, would remain permanently buried. On that point, they were mistaken. Tucked away in the hill country of Western Virginia, within a county whose name graces very few historical volumes, the birth records for every child born over a span of 43 consecutive years, from 1841 to 1884, all contain one identical, peculiar detail. It isn't the same county of origin, nor the same attending physician, nor a recurring family surname. The consistency lies in the line reserved for the witness to the birth. For 43 years, across hundreds of children, a single name persists. And throughout that entire county, not one soul who lived through those decades and remained to tell of it ever offered an explanation. Not to their own children. Not to their pastors. Not even to the county clerk who, in 1889, first questioned the true identity of that person. Before we proceed with the unsettling secret held by Harland County, if this is your first time watching, take a moment to subscribe and leave a comment letting us know which state or city is your point of origin. Our audience reaches places we never anticipated, and we're genuinely curious to know where this narrative is finding you. Because this particular story, once heard, has a tendency to linger. To grasp the true weight of those birth records, and the quiet dread their discovery instilled in every family still rooted in that part of Virginia, you first need to understand the fabric of life in the hill country during the years after 1840. This was not the Virginia of grand plantations and rolling tobacco fields that so often comes to mind. The western counties constituted an entirely separate world. The mountains there appeared more ancient, as if they had been compressing the earth for an impossibly long time, and the valleys nestled between them were constricted, prone to lingering shadows even at midday. The settlements, if they merited the name, were mere clusters of perhaps 200 to 300 souls at most, strung along creek beds and logging trails. Their existence was built on timber, on modest family farms, and on the quiet, unspoken compacts that dictate life in remote places. Outsiders were not easily trusted by people in these communities. This distrust extended to county officials, to circuit court judges, and to the men who periodically arrived from the more prosperous eastern counties to assess taxes on land whose boundaries had never been formally surveyed. In the hill country, trust was a currency earned over generations, measured in subtle gestures, a neighbor sharing seed corn during a desperate spring, a man appearing to help raise a barn without ever being asked. The seat of what was then called Aldermore County, a name that itself vanished from official Virginia maps after an 1891 redistricting, was a town named Greer's Mill. It boasted a courthouse, a general store, 2 Protestant churches whose congregations maintained a polite, age-old rivalry, a blacksmith, a small hotel that also served as a boarding house, and a population that ebbed and flowed between 140 and 180 depending on the season. The surrounding farmland was home to perhaps another 800 people, scattered across the ridges and hollows. These were families who might make the trip into Greer's Mill only 3 or 4 times annually, for supplies, for court business, or for the infrequent occasions when a traveling preacher came through to hold services in the larger of the 2 churches. Childbirth in these communities rarely involved a physician. In fact, there was no doctor in Greer's Mill until 1857, and even after Dr. Alton Prewitt established his practice, his effective reach was perhaps 5 miles in any direction. Beyond that, the roads became too poor, the distances too vast for a man on horseback to arrive in time to be of any assistance. Most births were therefore attended by midwives, experienced women whose knowledge was passed down through family lines, whose hands had guided countless infants into the world, and whose presence was considered both a practical necessity and a ceremonial tradition. The system for recording births in Aldermore County was itself informal by Eastern standards. A ledger book was maintained at the courthouse, and births were supposed to be registered within 30 days. In reality, many were recorded months later when a family member happened to be passing through Greer's Mill. Some were never entered at all. The clerk responsible for the ledger, a man named Howard Cutter who held the post from 1836 until his death in 1879, was known for his diligence with the records he did receive. He filled each entry in his careful, small handwriting: the child's name, the parents' names, the date of birth, the approximate location, the name of the attending midwife or physician, and the name of any witness present. And it was in that final column, the witness, where the anomaly resided. Howard Cutter passed away on a Tuesday in March of 1879, at 67, from what was termed inflammation of the lungs. He had served as county clerk for 43 years, having taken over in 1836 after his predecessor, Amos Veach, died from a fall off a horse. Cutter was known throughout the county as a precise and methodical man, generally unremarkable, the kind of person whose absence isn't truly felt until the machinery he operated begins to sputter without him. His successor was a younger man, George Harwick, 29 years old and newly married. Having grown up in Greer's Mill, he was appointed by the County Board of Supervisors, largely because he was literate, punctual, and willing to work for the modest salary the county could afford. Harwick spent his first weeks in the position acquainting himself with the ledgers, the tax rolls, the deed books, the marriage records, and the court dockets. It was routine, and he approached it methodically, just as Cutter had before him. He wasn't the type to go looking for trouble in old papers. But the birth ledger stopped him. He first noticed it on a cold April morning in 1879, about 6 weeks into the job. He was cross-referencing birth records with the death ledger, a clerical task required by the county to maintain what served as a census, when his eye caught the same name appearing twice in the witness column for entries from different years. Initially, he thought nothing of it. A midwife could reasonably appear dozens of times. But then he saw the name a third time, and a fourth. He began to go through the birth ledger systematically, starting from the earliest entries he could find. The ledger itself only went back to 1838. Records before that year had either never been compiled or had been lost, depending on who you asked. He worked forward through the decades, year by year, page by page. The name first appeared in a birth record dated April 14, 1841. The child was a boy named Thomas, born to a farming family named Dupree, on a property described as lying along the northern fork of Spruce Creek. The witness listed was a woman, her name written in Howard Cutter's unmistakable small handwriting, Nora Vance. Harwick moved to the next year. Nora Vance appeared again. He moved to the year after that. Nora Vance. He continued. She appeared in 1845, in 1848, in 1851. She appeared in records from the northern end of the county and from the southern end, locations separated by nearly 30 miles of rough terrain. She appeared in winter and in summer. She appeared in years when the county had a practicing midwife on record, and in years when it did not. By the time George Harwick had worked through to 1879, the year of his appointment, the year Howard Cutter died, he had found the name Nora Vance listed as witness in 67 birth records. 67 children, spanning 38 years. He closed the ledger and sat for a long moment in the cold courthouse office, the scent of old paper and tallow candles surrounding him, listening to the creak behind the building. Then he opened it again and checked his count. He had made no error. What Harwick did next was the most natural thing imaginable. He began asking around. He asked the older men who came to the courthouse on business if they knew a woman named Nora Vance. He asked the women who came to register deeds or pay taxes. He asked Howard Cutter's widow, a quiet woman named Martha, when she came to collect her late husband's outstanding wages. He asked the two clergymen, Reverend Delbert Sapp of the Methodist congregation and Reverend O.P. Newland of the Calvary Baptist, if the name was known to them. The responses he received were, in retrospect, far more interesting than the question itself. Most people said they didn't know the name, said it plainly and without hesitation. The The way you deny knowing someone you genuinely don't know. But Harwick was a careful observer of people, as men who work with documents often are, and he noticed that the question sometimes provoked a small, involuntary reaction before the denial. A stillness around the eyes. A slight pause before speaking. The look of a person deciding something, rather than simply answering. Martha Cutter, the late clerk's widow, was the most forthcoming. She was a woman in her mid-60s by then, possessing the particular directness that comes from having outlived most of the circumstances that would necessitate caution. She told Harwick she had heard the name once, perhaps 20 years prior, in connection with her husband. She had been sitting in the kitchen of their home while Howard was talking with a man at the back door. She couldn't see the man from where she sat, but she heard her husband say, in a tone she couldn't quite characterize, "You tell Nora Vance that this has to stop." She had asked her husband about it afterward. He simply said it was county business and never mentioned the name again. Harwick recorded this in his personal journal, a document that wouldn't surface for another decade, and continued his inquiries. The answers he received from the older farming families were collectively more suggestive than any single response. Several people acknowledged, with varying degrees of reluctance, that the name Vance was associated with a family that had lived in the most remote part of the county, far up one of the eastern hollows, away from the main roads. They spoke of this family the way people speak of something they have long ago decided not to think about, not with fear, exactly, but with a kind of practiced avoidance that had become so habitual it no longer felt like avoidance. One man, an elderly farmer named Rufus Dent, who was in his late 70s and seemed to have reached an age where consequences no longer held much weight, told Harwick something more specific. He said that when he was a boy, perhaps 12 or 13, which would place the memory around 1813 or 1814, nearly 70 years before the conversation, there had been a woman who came down from the eastern hollows to attend births throughout the county. He didn't know her family name as a child. She was called simply the Vance woman, or sometimes the woman from the hollow. She wasn't a midwife in the usual sense. She had never apprenticed with anyone, possessed no formal knowledge anyone could point to, but she was sought out, particularly for difficult births, because her presence was believed to ensure a good outcome. Not in a religious sense, Dent clarified. Not the way you'd call for a preacher. In a practical sense. Women attended by her were said to recover more quickly. Children born with her present were said to be stronger. He had seen her once as a boy, he said. She had come to his family's farm when his mother was in labor with what would become his youngest sister. He remembered a woman of indeterminate age. He had perceived her as old then, but he acknowledged that as a child he perceived most adults as old. She had dark eyes, an unhurried manner, and hands he had found, even at 12, somehow deeply unsettling without being able to say exactly why. His mother recovered. His sister survived. He hadn't seen the woman again after that. Harwick asked him how old she had appeared to be. Dent thought about it for a long moment. 40, perhaps, he said finally. Maybe 50. It's hard to say. She looked the same age the second time I saw her, and that was 30 years later. Harwick paused his writing. He looked up from his journal. You said you saw her only once, he said. Dent met his eyes without expression. I was wrong about that, he said. George Harwick was not by nature a man prone to superstition. He had been educated at a small academy in the eastern part of the state, had read his share of Enlightenment philosophy, and believed, in the practical, unsentimental way of men who work with documents and numbers, that most apparent mysteries have explanations rooted in human behavior, in deception, in coincidence, in the ordinary failures of memory and record-keeping. But the longer he spent with the birth ledger, the more difficult it became to maintain that posture. The records themselves were the problem. Howard Cutter had been methodical, and the entries reflected that. The handwriting in the witness column was consistent over the decades, showing only the slight deterioration that came with age. The name Nora Vance was not, in most entries, an unusual or prominent detail. It appeared as one piece of information among several, written in the same careful hand as the names of the parents and the dates. This was not a name added later, inserted for effect. It was simply there, embedded in the fabric of the records as naturally as any other detail. More troubling was the geography. In the weeks following his initial discovery, Harwick had begun plotting the locations of the recorded births on a rough map of the county pinned to the courthouse wall. The properties described were scattered across a vast area, from the creek bottoms near Greer's Mill to the high farms along the ridge roads. From the northern boundary near a settlement called Bone Lick to the remote southeastern hollows where old-growth timber still stood. Many of these locations were separated by distances that, given the road conditions of the 1840s and 1850s, would have required a full day's hard travel on horseback. The records showed, on more than 20 occasions, births attended by Nora Vance that occurred within a week of each other in locations that were, by the roughest calculation, 15 to 25 miles apart. This wasn't impossible. A person could travel those distances. But a midwife wouldn't travel that way. Not routinely. Not across decades. Not at the pace these records suggested. A midwife's territory was circumscribed by practical realities, road conditions, the physical demands of the work, the simple fact that a woman in labor couldn't always wait for someone to arrive from 20 miles away. A midwife, in other words, stayed close to where she was needed. Nora Vance, if the records were accurate, appeared to be everywhere at once. Harwick brought this observation to Dr. Alton Prewitt, the county's only practicing physician since 1857. Prewitt was in his late 50s, a cautious, deliberate man who had arrived from Ohio and spent 2 decades cultivating, with considerable effort, the trust of a community not naturally inclined to trust physicians. He listened to Harwick's account with the careful attention of a man who knows that what he says next will be repeated. "You're describing a situation that requires explanation," he said finally. "That's what I've been doing for 6 weeks, Harwick told him. "Then let me suggest 2 possibilities," Prewitt said. "The first is that there is more than one woman named Nora Vance. A name can persist in a family across generations. A daughter takes her mother's name, or is called by it. I considered that," Harwick said. "The handwriting is consistent. Cutter was recording one name, one woman, over 38 years. That doesn't mean it was one woman," Prewitt said. "It means Cutter believed it was one woman, or was told it was one woman." Harwick was quiet for a moment. "What's the second possibility?" he asked. Prewitt looked at him steadily. "That Howard Cutter knew exactly what he was doing," he said, "and that whatever arrangement he had with the Vance family was the kind of arrangement that is made once, kept carefully, and never discussed. This possibility, that Cutter's meticulous record-keeping wasn't incidental but deliberate, that the name appearing in the ledger wasn't an artifact of honest clerical work but a constructed and purposeful trail, hadn't fully occurred to Harwick until that moment. He thought of Martha Cutter's account of her husband at the back door, speaking to a man he couldn't see. "You tell Nora Vance that this has to stop." Whatever that conversation had been about, it had taken place sometime around 1858 or 1859, more than 20 years before Cutter's death. And the name had continued to appear in the records for another 20 years after that. Whatever it was Cutter had wanted to stop, it hadn't stopped. It was in the late summer of 1880, more than a year after his initial discovery, that George Harwick found the first piece of evidence that fundamentally changed the nature of his investigation. He had been corresponding with the county clerk of an adjacent county, a man named Peel, on routine administrative matters, and had mentioned in passing the anomaly in the birth records. He wasn't sure why he mentioned it, professional habit, perhaps, or the need that comes from sitting too long with an unanswered question. Peel's response arrived 3 weeks later, written in a hand that seemed to Harwick slightly less steady than Peel's usual correspondence. He wrote that he had, upon receiving Harwick's letter, checked his own county's birth records as a point of comparison. The name Nora Vance appeared in those records, too. Not as frequently, 6 times between 1843 and 1867, but it was there, in the same position, the witness column, in the same form. Peel added one detail that Harwick found himself reading twice. 2 of the 6 entries in the adjacent county's records were from properties described as lying on the far western edge of that county, which was to say on the opposite side of the mountain ridge from Aldermore County's eastern hollows. The same hollows where the Vance family was said to have lived. Harwick wrote back immediately, asking if Peel knew anything of the family's history. 3 weeks passed. A month. Harwick wrote again. He didn't receive a reply. He wrote a 3rd time in October of 1880, and the letter was returned to him unopened, stamped with a notation that the addressee was no longer at the listed address. Harwick made inquiries. What he learned was that Peel had resigned his position abruptly in September of 1880 and moved his family to Wheeling, in the northern Panhandle, leaving no forwarding address and offering no explanation to the county board he served. Those who had known Peel described him as having become, in the weeks before his departure, anxious and preoccupied, prone to interrupting conversations to look toward doorways or windows. His wife had told a neighbor he wasn't sleeping. Harwick never established contact with Peel again. What he did establish, through correspondence with clerks in 3 other surrounding counties and 2 days searching through archived territorial records at the state capital, was that the name Nora Vance appeared with varying frequency in the birth records of at least 4 counties across a geographic range of roughly 60 miles. The earliest appearance he could find was in a record from 1829, 51 years before the day he sat at his desk in the Greers Mill courthouse, staring at that figure. In the spring of 1881, George Harwick did something that, in retrospect, he would describe in his journal as the most consequential decision of his adult life. He went to the Eastern Hollow. He went alone on a Saturday, telling no one where he was going. By then, he had asked enough questions to have established approximately where the Vance family property lay, far up a tributary of Spruce Creek, past where the maintained road ended and the track became a path of packed earth and exposed root. One of the older farmers who had eventually become willing to speak about the subject told him there was a house up there. Had been a house, at least as of 20 or 30 years prior. Whether it was still inhabited, the farmer couldn't say. He rode for most of the morning, the path becoming progressively less defined as he climbed, the forest closing overhead in a way that turned the late April light green and diffuse, the sound of the creek below a constant, low presence that seemed to get no closer no matter how far he traveled. The air at that altitude carried a smell he would later try several times to describe accurately in his journal and never fully succeed, something like old wood and cold water and something else, something slightly sharp, like the air before a storm, except the sky in the fragments he could see through the canopy was perfectly clear. He found the house in the early afternoon. It was smaller than he had expected, a 2-room cabin of hewn timber, old enough that the wood had gone almost black with age, set back from the path in a flat clearing someone had at some point deliberately leveled out of the hillside. There was a kitchen garden in the rear, recently turned. A woodpile neatly stacked beside the south wall. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and pale in the bright spring air. Someone was home. He dismounted and stood at the edge of the clearing, aware of how quiet it was. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of attention, the particular quality of stillness you feel when you know you are being watched. He had experienced that feeling before, in legal situations, when the counterparty knew more than they were showing. He recognized it here. He called out. He announced himself as the county clerk of Aldermore County. He said he was there on official business and asked if anyone was present. After a moment, the door of the cabin opened. The woman who appeared in the doorway was not what he had expected, though he couldn't have said precisely what he had expected. She was not old, or rather, she did not appear old. She was perhaps 40 years of age, perhaps a few years more, with dark hair pulled back and eyes that were neither hostile nor welcoming. She stood in the doorway with the quality of someone who has decided, before answering the door, exactly how much of themselves they intend to reveal. "Mr. Harwick," she said. He had not told her his name. He would remember this for the rest of his life, that she had said his name before he said hers. "You know who I am," he said. Word travels, she said simply. You've been asking questions about me for a year. He was silent for a moment, recalibrating. Then you know what I want to ask, he said. She regarded him with that same careful, measured quality. Come in, she said. I'll put water on. What happened inside that cabin on that April afternoon in 1881 is recorded in Harwick's private journal in some detail, though the journal itself wasn't discovered until 1913, when it turned up in a box of miscellaneous papers purchased at an estate auction in Greenbrier County, and didn't come to the attention of any historical researcher until the early 1940s. The woman in the cabin told Harwick her name was Nora. She didn't volunteer a family name, and he didn't press, having learned by then that there were things in that county that became more opaque the harder you pushed. She was not what the older residents' accounts had suggested. She wasn't mysterious or evasive in the way Harwick had perhaps unconsciously anticipated. She was practical. She answered his questions directly, which was, in its own way, more unsettling than if she had been coy. She told him that the Vance name in the birth records was correct, that it had always referred to one woman, that the woman had not always been her. She explained what she meant with a patience that suggested she had explained it before, to people who had asked, as Harwick was asking, from a position of confusion she had long since moved past. The Vance name, she said, was not a family name in the conventional sense. It was something closer to a title or a role. There had always been a Vance in that hollow, and the role of the Vance, as she put it without apparent self-consciousness, was to attend births throughout the region. Why? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Because someone has to know, she said. He asked what that meant. What was it that had to be known? She looked at him with the expression of a person deciding how much trust is warranted. The record that Mr. Cutter kept, she said finally, was not the only record. This was the center of it. This was the thing George Harwick had been circling for 18 months without knowing it. The Vance women had kept their own records, had kept them, by the account the woman in the hollow gave Harwick that afternoon, for as far back as anyone in the family could trace, which was to say further back than the county's official records went, further back than the courthouse ledgers, further back than the earliest territorial surveys. What kind of records? Birth records, she said, but not the kind the county kept. The county recorded names, dates, locations. The Vance records recorded something different. They recorded what she called conditions, a word that, in the context of the conversation as Harwick later set it down, seemed to mean something more than the physical state of the mother or the health of the child. The conditions of the birth in a broader sense, who was present, what was said, what debts existed between families and how those debts bore on the circumstances of the birth, who the father was in cases where the official record named someone else, who the child resembled. Harwick wrote in his journal that he sat with this for a long moment before responding. Then he asked, why would someone keep records like that? The woman looked at him with something that might have been, in another context, amusement. Why do you keep records, she said. He said, because the county requires it. Because the law depends on accurate documentation of births and deaths and property transfers. Yes, she said. And these records serve a similar function. He asked her to explain. She said, there are things that happen in communities that the official records do not capture. Arrangements that are made between families. Agreements that are honored or broken. Obligations that pass from one generation to the next without ever being written down in the courthouse ledger. The kind of things that determine who inherits land, who owes a debt, who has a claim on whom. In a place like this, in a county like this, those undocumented arrangements weren't minor details. They were the actual architecture of how people lived. The Vance records, she said, were an accounting of that architecture. Harwick asked the obvious question. He asked why the official county records bore the Vance name as witness. Why had Cutter, for nearly 40 years, been writing that name in the ledger? She was quiet for a moment. The fire in the hearth made a sound. The thin thread of smoke rose from the chimney outside. Because he was one of the people who needed things not to be in the official record. This was the claim Harwick found most difficult to absorb, and the one he spent the most time examining in the pages of his journal. Howard Cutter had been county clerk for 43 years. He was known as a meticulous and honest man. His official record was, by all accounts, clean. The ledgers he kept were accurate and carefully maintained, and there was no suggestion in any account Harwick had gathered that Cutter had engaged in any of the corruption common in rural county governance of that era. No sale of favorable assessments, no manipulation of land records, no embezzlement of tax revenues. But the woman in the hollow made a different kind of claim. She didn't say Cutter was corrupt. She said Cutter was *careful*. That the relationship between Cutter and the Vance family had been, from his perspective, a form of insurance. By recording the Vance name in the birth ledger, he was acknowledging, in an oblique and deniable way, that the Vance women existed and that their records existed. This acknowledgement served, in the logic of the arrangement, as a kind of guarantee. A signal to anyone who knew how to read it that the official records and the Vance records were in alignment, that nothing in the courthouse ledger contradicted what the hollow ledger contained. Why would a county clerk want such a guarantee? Because, she said, Howard Cutter had a secret that the Vance records documented. She didn't tell Harwick what the secret was. She said only that it was the kind of secret that required the official record to be maintained with particular care, and that Cutter had understood, from very early in his tenure, that the best protection for a man who needed official records to be trusted was to be himself genuinely trustworthy. Harwick asked, was this secret something that could harm people who are still living? She considered this for a long moment. It's already harmed some of them, she said quietly. The ones who are still living chose to keep it. He asked who they were. She didn't answer. He asked a different question. He asked how many families in the county had entries in the Vance ledger that differed in significant ways from what the official record contained. She looked at him steadily. Enough, she said. That you should think carefully about what you do with the question. George Harwick rode back down from the hollow in the late afternoon, the sun slanting through the trees and throwing long shadows across the path. He didn't look back. He had the distinct sense, which he recorded in his journal with a precision that suggests he was trying to fix it accurately, even as he experienced it, that the clearing behind him had become empty the moment he turned away from it. He didn't go to the hollow again. What he did over the following months was more cautious and, in its way, more revealing than a second visit might have been. He paid close attention to the community around him. He watched specifically for evidence of what he had been told, for signs in the behavior of the older families of the kind of undocumented architecture the woman in the hollow had described. He found it, not in dramatic form, not in accusations or confrontations or anything that would have been visible to a casual observer. He found it in the small, unremarkable transactions that constitute the daily life of a rural community. In the way certain families treated certain other families. In which land disputes were pursued aggressively, and which were allowed to quietly resolve. In whose credit at the general store was honored without question, and whose was scrutinized. He found it in silences. In the specific, almost tangible quality of quiet that came over a room when certain subjects were approached. The way conversation would redirect itself around particular names or particular years, with the practiced ease of water moving around an obstacle it has learned to avoid. He had been living in this community for 2 years. He had thought he was learning it. He understood now that he had been reading the official version of it, the surface record, while the actual ledger existed somewhere else entirely. In September of 1881, he received an unexpected visitor at the courthouse. The man gave his name as Dyer. He offered no first name, and Harwick didn't ask. He was perhaps 60 years old, a farmer by appearance, a man of the county by his manner. He said he had heard that the new clerk had been asking questions about old records. Harwick said yes, that was accurate. The man said he wanted to offer some advice. He said, there are records in this county that have been kept a certain way for a long time. The people who kept them that way had reasons. Some of those reasons are still operating. Harwick asked what he meant. The man looked at him with an expression that was not hostile. It was, Harwick wrote later, almost kind, the expression of a person delivering a warning because they have decided the warning is genuinely warranted. There are people in this county, the man said, who have built their lives on the assumption that certain things are settled. Land. Names. Family lines. If the records you're looking at suggest that those things aren't settled the way people believe they are, it would be better for a lot of people if that stayed as a private question. Harwick said, "Are you suggesting I stop my inquiry?" "I'm suggesting," the man said carefully, "that you think about what the inquiry is ***. If it's for the county to improve the records, there's nothing in those records that affects the county now. The people those records belong to are mostly dead or gone." He paused. "And if it's for something else," he said, "then I'd suggest you think about who else might be asking the same question." He left without being asked to stay. Harwick sat in the empty courthouse for a long time after, listening to the sound of the creek. 2 weeks later, someone broke into the courthouse during a night when Harwick wasn't present. Nothing was taken. The only disturbance was in the storage room where the older ledgers were kept. The books had been moved, not damaged, rearranged, as if someone had been looking for something. The birth ledger was in its place. Harwick checked it carefully. Nothing had been removed, but 3 pages near the back of the ledger, covering records from the late 1870s, had been partially erased. The witness column had been scraped with a knife and rewritten in a hand close to Howard Cutter's, but not identical. The name that had been written in those 3 entries was not Nora Vance. It was simply unknown. Harwick spent the winter of 1881 and into the spring of 1882 in a state he described in his journal as one of suspended decision. He had information, fragmentary, second-hand, partially verified, that suggested the official record of the county's history was a carefully maintained fiction built over a structure of private knowledge. He couldn't prove this. He couldn't name names. He couldn't produce the document, the Vance ledger, that would have made the matter concrete. He could also not unhear what the woman in the hollow had told him. In April of 1882, he received a letter. It bore no return address and had been left, not mailed, in the courthouse mail slot, which meant whoever wrote it had come to Greer's Mill and delivered it by hand. The letter was brief. It read, in its entirety, "There are 47 entries in the county birth record bearing the Vance name that do not match the Vance ledger. Of those 47, 11 concerned children whose recorded parentage is incorrect. Of those 11, 4 concerned families that still hold significant property in this county. The names of those families are known to you. If you know which 4 I mean, you understand why no further communication on this subject is possible. Burn this letter." Harwick didn't burn it. He kept it folded inside the back cover of his journal, where it remained for 30 years until the journal itself was sold at auction. He didn't act on it. He didn't act on it, he wrote, because he understood the situation with a clarity that had taken him nearly 3 years to achieve. The Vance records were not a weapon and had never been intended as one. They were, as the woman had said, an accounting. A parallel record of the true structure of the community, maintained not for the purpose of exposure, but for the purpose of stability. The person who had written that letter wasn't trying to provoke him into action. They were telling him exactly enough to ensure he understood what he was dealing with. The 4 families whose parentage records were incorrect were almost certainly the 4 families whose land holdings and community standing depended, in ways a careful examination of deed records and inheritance lines would reveal on the official birth record remaining unquestioned. To expose the discrepancy wouldn't merely embarrass those families. It would unravel a set of property rights and social arrangements that had been operating unchallenged for decades. The legal consequences alone would have been catastrophic. The human consequences, in a county where property disputes had within living memory ended in violence, didn't bear thinking about. Harwick made his decision. He decided to do nothing. He continued in his position as county clerk for another 11 years, until 1893, when Aldermore County was redistricted out of existence and its records were absorbed into the newly constituted county that replaced it. He was known throughout his tenure as a reliable and conscientious official. The birth ledger was transferred, along with all other county records, to the new county courthouse. The erased pages remained as they were. He never went back to the Eastern Hollow. He never tried to contact the woman again. He never tried to find the Vance ledger. In the final entry of his journal, written in 1913 and dated simply March, he wrote, "I do not know if she is still there. I do not know if there is still a Vance in that hollow keeping the other record. I do not know, and I have made my peace with not knowing. A man in my position handles documents. What those documents represent and what they conceal, what they protect, what they would destroy if they were read differently, is not always a thing a county clerk is meant to understand." Howard Cutter understood this. I understood it later than he did. Perhaps that is the difference between a man who spends 40 years in a place and one who spends only 14. But there is one thing I know that I have always known. From the moment she said my name in that doorway before I had spoken a word, she was not surprised to see me. She had been waiting. And I have spent 30 years wondering what she was waiting for, and whether whatever it was ever arrived. The Harwick Journal surfaced publicly in 1943, when a historian named Cecil Abbott, at a small college in the Shenandoah Valley, published an account of it in a regional academic journal. Abbott had come across the journal as part of a larger project researching pre-Civil War administrative records in the Virginia mountain counties, and the Vance anomaly, as he called it in his article, occupied about 4 pages of a 22-page paper on clerical record-keeping practices. His article attracted almost no attention at the time. The country was at war. Academic papers on 19th-century county administration weren't widely read in any period. But Abbott had done something Harwick hadn't. He had tried, in a limited way, to locate the Vance ledger. He hadn't found it. What he had found and recorded in 4 additional pages he ultimately didn't include in the published article, which came to light only when his own papers were donated to the college archive in 1971, was a pattern of absence he found more significant than any presence could have been. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, following the redistricting of Aldermore County, several legal proceedings had taken place in the new county courthouse that bore, in Abbott's reading, the unmistakable marks of the kind of property dispute that would result from the correction of an incorrect birth record. None of these proceedings mentioned Vance, or the birth ledger, or anything that could be directly connected to the situation Harwick had described. But they were there. Quiet, unremarkable court actions, settled out of the public record with a swiftness that suggested private agreement rather than legal resolution. Abbott wrote in his unpublished notes, "The most interesting aspect of these proceedings is not their outcome, which in each case favored the established holder of the property in question, but their timing. They cluster in the years 1887 to 1893, precisely the period during which the redistricting would have brought new eyes to old records. Someone with knowledge of the birth ledger anomaly was, in these years, systematically protecting the families in question from legal challenge. That person had to have access to both the official records and the Vance records. That person, or the family of that person, is still in this county." He didn't name who he believed that person to be. His notes didn't go further. When asked in a letter from a colleague in 1952 whether he had pursued the matter after the war, Abbott wrote back a single paragraph, "I had occasion to visit the county in 1948 while researching a separate project. I made inquiries about a Vance family in the Eastern Hill Country. I was told by 3 separate individuals, and with a uniformity that suggested coordination, that no Vance family had ever lived in that area, and that the name did not appear in any local record. I thought about what Harwick had written, that the woman knew his name before he spoke it, and that she had been waiting. I did not go up the hollow. I think that was the correct decision. What remains, in the end, is what always remains in cases like this. Not evidence, but shape. The shape of a secret pressed into the available record, like the impression of a leaf in old stone. The birth ledger from Aldermore County, the original document bearing Howard Cutter's handwriting and the 67 entries marked with the name Nora Vance, was transferred to the State Archives during a records consolidation project in the 1920s. It can be examined today, or could be examined when the archive was last known to be accessible in the mid-20th century, before the relevant section was moved to off-site storage pending a renovation that, if the available information is accurate, was never completed. The Vance Ledger, the other record, the private accounting of the actual architecture of the county's family life, has never been found. No historian, no legal researcher, no journalist who has followed the trail of the Harwick Journal has located a document matching its description. This is, depending on your disposition, either evidence that it never existed, or evidence that it was very well hidden. The four families referenced in the anonymous letter to Harwick, the families whose property holdings depended on an incorrect birth record, were never definitively identified. Abbott believed he knew two of them. His unpublished notes named two surnames he had identified through cross-referencing the property disputes of 1887 to 1893 with the birth records of the 1840s and 1850s. He didn't publish these names. He didn't explain, in any document he left behind, why he chose not to publish them. George Harwick died in 1921 at the age of 71, having spent the last 28 years of his life working in a hardware store in Lewisburg. He never discussed the journal publicly. He never returned to Greer's Mill. He had two children, a son and a daughter, who survived him. Neither appears to have known about the journal. Howard Cutter's widow, Martha, died in 1893, a few months after the redistricting that erased Aldermore County from the official maps. She is buried in a cemetery in what is now the eastern edge of the county that replaced it. Her gravestone names her husband and his years of service as county clerk. It contains no other identifying information. The woman in the hollow, the woman who told George Harwick her name was Nora, who said the record Mr. Cutter kept was not the only record, who knew his name before he spoke, does not appear in any official record, in any form. Not in the birth ledger. Not in the death records. Not in the tax rolls of Aldermore County or any surrounding county. Not in the census records of 1850, 1860, 1870, or 1880. She appears only in the birth records, in the witness column, in 67 entries spanning 38 years, and before that, in records from adjacent counties going back to 1829. And if the Vance Ledger exists, in whatever hidden place it has been kept since George Harwick declined to search for it, it contains the true version of this story. The names, the details, the debts and obligations and biological facts the official record was built to conceal. It contains, presumably, the full accounting of what Howard Cutter wanted stopped and could not stop, and what it cost him to carry that knowledge for 40 years, writing the same name in the same careful hand, year after year after year. A record is only as honest as the person who keeps it. And some records, it turns out, are kept by more than one person. That has always been the unsettling part. Not the name that appeared 67 times, but the name that appeared nowhere at all, and knew everything. Anyway, we're curious to hear your thoughts on this story. Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this and would like to hear more narratives like it, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who appreciates a dark mystery. We'll see you in the next one.